We'll start in just a minute here, folks, for those who have signed on, and we're just waiting for all the participants to join.
Are people logged in? People do not have access to this.
Minute as our participants join. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Dan Moshavi. I am the Dean of the Lucas College and Graduate School of Business here at San Jose State University. And I am delighted for our program this evening is Marketing Everything for an Entrepreneurial Company with two longtime Silicon Valley gurus, Regis Mckenna and Andy Cunningham, going to share their wisdom with you tonight. Before we get started and I introduce them, however, I would like to acknowledge that the Silicon Valley Center for Entrepreneurship and the Ideas Club are co-hosts of this event. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I will be turning it over to David McFeely, my marketing colleague, who will be facilitating this evening's event. So a little bit about our guest speakers. First, Regis Mckenna. If you've been around the Valley for a long time, you certainly know of Regis. He is considered the marketing guru of Silicon Valley in many ways. He's a well-known technology marketing consultant, advisor to entrepreneurs, venture capitalist, and author of a number of books on marketing. Probably one of his most enduring legacies will be the 8-part world history series he recorded with the Computer History Museum in 2018 and 19. He honed his skills at General Microelectronics, National Semiconductor in the early 60s, and then later founded his own high-tech marketing and consulting firm, Regis Mckenna, Inc. in 1970. Some of the brands that Regis has touched over the years include America Online, Intel, Compaq, Genentech, and Electronic Arts. He may be most famous for recognizing a new upstart by the name of Steve Jobs and launching Apple Computer. His firm evolved from a high-tech outsourced marketing business focused on high-tech startups into a broad-based marketing strategy firm servicing international clients in many different industries. So I'm delighted to welcome Regis Mckenna this evening. Also joining us is Andy Cunningham. Andy is the founder and president of Cunningham Collective, marketing strategy firm with an expertise in positioning companies to win. She is also the author of the Amazon bestseller, Get to Aha, Discover Your Positioning DNA and Dominate Your Competition. Andy is currently working on a follow-up to that book, and she is the host of the popular podcast, Marketing Over Ice. Andy is an entrepreneur at the forefront of marketing, branding, positioning, and communicating the next big thing. Andy first came to Silicon Valley in 1983 to actually work for Regis Mckenna and to help launch the Apple Macintosh personal computer with Steve Jobs. So it's my pleasure to welcome both Regis and Andy. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, David McFeely, who will be moderating the discussion this evening. David?
Thank you, Dean Moshavi. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy and Regis, for joining us tonight. And to my colleague, Heidi Isis, and Professor Basu for facilitating this. So appreciate you guys tonight, and let's see what we can do for the students. Before I forget, let me just mention that this is being sponsored by the Sabono Honors Program and the Ideas Club. And I'll try to remember, Anu, to give you some time at the end to promote that a little bit more. But without further ado, let me go to my first opening question here. And I think I'll pose the question to Regis first. Very simply, Regis, if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you came into marketing roles.
It's not very simple. It's serendipitous more than anything else. But when I was in college, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and went to a local college there. And when I graduated, I was looking for a job, and this was in an era, this was in the late 50s. Unemployment in Pittsburgh was, I think, 40–50%. I mean, it was the steel mills were the primary industry in Pittsburgh at that time, and most of those had decayed and were dying due to foreign competition. But there was a publisher who put out ads and things for employment, and I tried it. And it was a technical publisher of all things in Pittsburgh, and they published a number of technology journals and books and things of that nature. And the publisher was looking for someone to come in and kind of be an assistant, which I qualified, and I'm not sure how, but I did. And because my degree was in philosophy. And in any event, I didn't tell him that. I told him I was in liberal arts, and he said, good. God damn it. He said, those journalism majors keep coming in and trying to tell me how to run my business. So we got along really well. And I learned all the publishing business, and I did a lot of tech editing, articles and journals and proofreading and things of that nature. So I was seeing a lot of technology without necessarily having a background in it, and having to learn how to read what it meant. And I'm sort of a perennial student, so I spent a lot of time looking up and reading about the things that I would have to write or edit. After a while, he basically called me one Sunday and asked me if I wanted to move to California, and he wanted an open office out here. And I put my hand over the phone, asked my wife, do you want to move to California? And remember now, Pennsylvania is the stay-at-home state. People don't leave that state when they're born there. And so, 2 weeks later, we were in California. It was really landed in the middle of Silicon Valley, and I had an office basically along 101. And I then went to, I worked for a couple of years for that company. I then had a job with a small consulting firm. And then I went to work for a company called General Microelectronics, which was one of the spin-outs of Fairchild. I became marketing services manager there, and I ran a tech writing group as well. Most of the business was with aerospace companies, so we had a huge technical proposal group, and did basically it was really marketing. The engineers really had product managers and marketing. That was pretty much it. And it was a small company, and I learned the entire business of semiconductors, under that roof. It was probably no more than $10 million in size, but they did everything from the ingots to making calculators. That company was bought by Philco Ford. And I didn't want to go work for a big company in Philadelphia, so I started looking around, but I got a request from Don Valentine, who was the new director of marketing at National Semiconductor. They were just a startup. They were a few weeks old, and they were actually opening an office across the street from where my office was. So I walked across the street and was interviewed. I became the third person in marketing at National Semiconductor. And my education really began at GME, but Don Valentine, instead of saying, okay, you're in marketing, you're going to sit around and come up with ads and brochures and press releases and those kinds of things, he said, you're not going to learn anything behind your desk. And he put me on the road. And so I spent a good deal of my time, I would say half of my time, traveling around, visiting customers and clients and salesmen and distributors around, mostly in Europe, but in Asia and other places. And, and you get an education anytime you talk to the marketplace. And so that became my prep. And I left National in 1970 to start my own firm because there were so many startups starting. I thought it would be a good idea to, offer what I had learned to them for money. That's about it.
Thank you. And then Andy, to you, the same question. How did you wind up working for Regis and working on the Apple Macintosh introduction? Unmute your microphone.
Andy, you're muted.
How's that? Better?
Yep.
Is that better? Okay, great.
Yes.
So Regis is the reason that I ended up working on launching the Macintosh, and I had come, I worked for a big public relations agency in Chicago called Burson Marsteller at the time, and Burson Marsteller was about to open up an office in Silicon Valley, and I thought it would be really cool to work in Silicon Valley because I was in love with the personal computer and everything that Regis had done. But I went to meet the man that was running that office, and unfortunately, I just didn't think I could work for him. So I took an opportunity to try to get a couple of other meetings with other agencies that day, and Regis happened to be available, and he agreed to see me at the end of that day. And by the end of the meeting, he asked me if I wanted to come aboard and help launch the Macintosh. It was like a dream come true. So that's how I came to do all of that, and it changed my life forever in an incredibly positive way.
Great, great. So each of you have worked for some of the most iconic product companies and introductions in the history of the Valley. What is your first big learning? And let's flip it around and let's go with Andy first.
I'm
Can
sorry.
you guys
I
hear me?
missed-
Sorry, can you hear me, David? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So what was my first big learning? Is that the question? It's the language was entirely different. I'd never heard of a foil before, for example, and none of you kids either have. But it used to be back in the day that we made presentations with slides, with real slides that you had to take pictures of and go send out for development, and they'd come back in a slide tray. You had to put them in upside down and backwards, and that's how you made a presentation. When I came to Silicon Valley, they were using these things called foils with an overhead projector. And I didn't understand, I didn't know what a foil was. And that was the beginning of many new words that I learned when I came to Silicon Valley. It was a whole new place doing things in a whole new way.
And Regis, what was the first big thing that you learned? I like the way you talked about being on the road and getting out to meet your customers.
You know, David, I never thought about it as an event, quite frankly. I mean, I often used to say that marketing is a process, not an event. And I think that the learning thing is a process. I mean, once you enter the world of business today, or, you know, in the last 50 years, quite frankly, you are in an educational process, or you should be. And certainly when you're in a marketing process, which is gaining knowledge from the outside and applying it inside, learning about the business so you can educate the outside, and learning about the outside so you can educate the business about the customer, that's a learning process yourself. And I've often said, and in fact, some people have written this, that the early days of Silicon Valley, everybody was learning. You know, the engineers were learning. No one that ran the companies in the first 20 years in Silicon Valley had an MBA or a marketing degree or nor ran a big corporation or even a medium-sized corporation. They were engineers who left because they had a better idea, they thought, and they had to learn marketing on the fly. They had to learn business on the fly. They had to learn how to hire salespeople, how to, you know, to set up distribution channels. So everybody was learning. And, you know, the first thing you learn is to join that process, to put yourself into a situation where you can, you know, even at GME, which was the first high-tech company, I traveled the world with the president and with the vice president of marketing. I met with customers with them. You know, I was able to walk out and see how these things are made. I traveled to the various plants. So because they did, and you learn alongside everybody else. And one of the things you learn is that what they respect is that you can contribute, that you're not simply repeating or, you know, what they say, but that you are sort of adding to the conversation. And so that makes you work harder. That makes you, study harder. And I think my family can attest to the fact, I spend many, many nights working and reading and preparing. I'm always prepared for everything I ever do. And some of you may know that I've kept notebooks, for example, since 1970, pretty detailed notebooks. And those notebooks are longhand. They're on Apple and Intel and probably more than 100 different companies. Those notebooks are at Stanford right now, and they've been digitized, but there's not a date set for when they're going to be available. I think I want to wait till I'm 6 feet under till that happens.
Thank you, Regis. Andy, in your book, Get to Aha, Discovering Your Positioning DNA and Dominating Your Competition, you describe core DNA of mothers, mechanics, and missionaries. Can you expand on that for startups and how it intersects with company culture and brand?
Sure. So I was forced to actually figure out how I came up with these positioning ideas that I was having for clients by a prospective client. And so I locked myself in my office over the course of a long weekend, and I basically did a manual cluster analysis of all of the companies that I had worked with over time. And after several hours, I wound up with 3 piles, and those piles reflected companies that I nicknamed mothers, but they were really very customer-oriented companies. And then there was a pile that reflected very product-oriented companies that I nicknamed mechanics. And then there was a much smaller pile of companies that really were focused on changing behavior at a fundamental level, and I called them missionaries as a nickname. But the reason that these 3 piles occurred is that these companies all did things entirely differently. They measured success differently, they structured themselves differently, they hired different kinds of people, they trained those people differently, they went to market differently. And I figured if there was a difference, that big of a difference in how these companies behaved, that it would be useful to know what that DNA is or what that difference is before you began to try to figure out a positioning strategy or a marketing strategy for a company. So I ended up doing more and more research into these different kinds of companies. I learned how they actually positioned themselves differently, and it turned into this DNA strategy that is really just like companies are very much like people, because they're made up of people and they serve people. And if you can reflect your DNA as a company out in the market, you end up with a much more authentic and genuine ability to describe yourself. So it's only one of many lenses that I think you need to look at when you're figuring out your position in the market, but it's a critical one because it's what you're made of at the core. And then people usually ask me, can you change your DNA? Yes, you can. Amazon is changing its DNA every day, trying to become much more customer-centric than they were. They even have come out with a mission statement, a new mission in the last few years. They want to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And they are taking very proactive steps to become that. That's not really how they started. So anyway, it does affect culture because it's how you treat people, it's how you hire people, it's who you hire, it's how you train them. It's at the core of everything we do, just like human DNA. So that's really where that all came from.
All right, thank you. Let me turn back to Regis here. And Regis, I'm going to quote some stuff here from one of your tutorials. So in your tutorial, Marketing is Everything, you begin with, we are witnessing the emergence of a new marketing paradigm, not a do more marketing that simply turns up the volume on sales spiels of the past, but a knowledge and experience-based marketing that represents the once and for all death of the salesman. Oh my God. Can you expand on that, Regis, for our students?
Yeah, the Salesforce.com, for example, is the death of a salesman. It's a good example of it. Software is the death of a salesman. Software, the salesman is represented in software today. People receive more information through the windows, if you will, of the world. All those little screens that you carry around with you are delivering services. And that's all done with software, and it's all done through IT. It's not done with a salesman calling on you. People buy their cars. They buy, more and more, expensive kinds of things over online. And so what's happened is that the retail businesses have been hurt. I mean, it's why Amazon has succeeded, because quite frankly, everything is so highly automated, including their AWS system, which is one of the most prolific, basically background software support systems for any kind of a retail environment that you can imagine. When you look at the difference between a local grocery store that carries, for example, 50,000 products on its shelves, and you look at a Walmart that carries 5 million, then how do you manage that? So, you manage it through IT. You don't manage it through people counting the shelves and the products every day. And so, and how do you deliver that on time? Well, you deliver it through IT, and customers are the most customers are unhappy because they can't get what they want when they want it. And so that is all now available to them, provided that the entire system doesn't collapse, which it has done in our jam ups in the ports today. I mean, it's interesting that a mechanical jam up is really creating more of a delivery and software problem than the mechanical problem itself.
Thank you. I want to make, before I move on with another question here for Andy and Regis, I want to remind the audience that we will be taking student questions in the very near future here. And so I'll be asking Anu here if we have any questions online from the chat for you guys. But before we do that, let me go kind of in honoring the title of tonight's talk, which is, all about startups and startup mistakes and marketing with startups. Let me direct this question to Andy first. What is the biggest mistake a startup can make in marketing, and what is the smartest thing they should do?
Marketing everything. Marketing is everything, right? Marketing is figuring out how to build a product that the market is going to want to buy, and then figuring out how to bring that product to market, how to make people aware of that product. Marketing is at the very core of should be at the very core of every company. The biggest mistake many companies make, many startups make, is somebody has an idea about what a product might be, but they have no idea if the market might want it or use it, and they develop it. And every once in a while, it turns into something amazing. And isn't that awesome? That's incredible. But that was, in my opinion, more luck than brains. And so a lot of technology companies just don't understand the criticality of marketing, and they subdue it. But if you were bringing out a new soda or a new popsicle, right, or a new laundry detergent, marketing is at the center of the development of that product, the execution of taking it to market, the awareness of it, all of that stuff. So consumer packaged goods companies are much more advanced, if you will, in the use of marketing than technology companies are, because technology companies have traditionally relied on a great engineer with a great idea, with the idea that if we build it, they will come. And every once in a while, they do come, but not every time.
And Regis, the same question to you. What have you seen the biggest mistake with new startups? You've probably seen more than your fair share over the years. And what is, in your opinion, what is it that they should be doing differently?
Well, I think that I counted them up one time, and I guess I've worked with 300 startups over my career. First of all, I think that who invests in your company is more important than how much they invest. Your board, because they really formulate your board, and your board determines what kind of in a large extent, in those early days, what kind of a company you are. Are they knowledgeable about your business? Are they can they help you expand your business? I often say it has to be some sort of an experienced board, because can you imagine? I mean, I've been on the board with a lot of people in the tech industry, and for example, I've been on the board with John Doerr, managing director at Kleiner. I've been on the board with John Young, president of HP. And when you sit in meetings with people who have this kind of experience, they've gone through it all. They know mistakes. They can better advise you on what you're doing and how to move next. They can also introduce you to more and more customers that are of large scale that can influence what you make and how you make it. And they influence your distribution channels simply by, and today, when I say in today's world, everybody's a distribution channel. There's so much partnering going on that you can find a piece of somebody's business in someone else's product all the time. So there's all of these kind of complex mechanisms that go on when you have people at a higher level, either advisors or on your board that are intimately involved in your company. I think the advice is to start small, gain experience. I think about the .com area. I did a lot of sort of analysis of the .coms. Pet.com was a very popular company. They spent $100 million on advertising. They sold that logo, pets.com, for $1 million when they went out of business. So they spent $100 million, they earned $1 million. I would say that, and if you look at most of the .coms, that was the same thing for almost every one of them. They first thought marketing was going out and promoting something. The product wasn't prepared. It wasn't reliable. It wasn't priced right. It wasn't positioned well, all of those kinds of things. And they didn't have the experience on how to adjust or to redirect the market. And so as a result, they were out there promoting themselves. And as recently as 2 years ago, was talking to a fellow out of Stanford who had started a company. He was 21 years old. And he would call me every other day with a problem. Like, I have to hire people that are older than me. How do I tell them what to do? I said, you don't tell them what to do. you lead them, but you have to lead people who are willing to be in this with you. So, it's a whole different way of thinking about, I see marketing as everything because, quite frankly, when it comes down to it, the company is judged by how it performs in the market. So if it is a lousy performance, whether it's the financial market or the real goods and services market, the CEO is the one who's going to get the axe if it's not working. And he's the one that's going to be replaced by someone who does know how to make it better. So marketing is really key to everything that people do in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you. Related to this topic, I have a question here from one of our audience, Jared. I'm going to direct it first to Andy because it kind of piggybacks on what both of you have been saying about getting to know your customer. And he writes, as a startup company, knowing your customer is highly important. Surveys and interviews are the most common ways of gathering customer information. But most people don't want to be bothered with interviews and surveys. How do you convince them to participate? I don't have any money to offer, and I'm still building his minimum viable product. So we have a budding entrepreneur here in the audience.
Well, this is an easy one for me. So when you're in a startup situation, you don't have hundreds and hundreds of customers. You have a very small number of them. And you need to have a relationship with every one of them. I think Regis would agree with me on that because I learned that from him. It's all about relationship building. And it's not about a survey. You don't hand your minimum viable product customer a survey. You call them up or you go and visit them and you have a discussion about it and you build a relationship with them. And you should be doing that all over time, even when you do get hundreds of customers, because then you can begin to use technology to help you with those relationships.
And Regis, the same question to you.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to Andy's. I mean, first of all, you have to do really serious self-examination as to whether or not your product is viable in the marketplace. And, it's not always simply a question of marketing. It's a question of also, is the innovation, is it that right time for it? Is it seen as something that can add to people's life value, or as to enhance their product that they're presently using, or is it an adjunct to it? I mean, there's so many different facets to thinking about what goes wrong rather than, how do we correct what we're doing or how do we correct the product? So there may be all sorts of things going on that, I'm hesitating just not to come up with names because I don't want to incriminate people, but quite frankly, too many people go out there too early with products that are not viable. And believe me, over 50% of the consumer products are failures, by the way, just so you all know that. So, we see new products and there's tens of thousands of new products that go out there every day. And, I'll quote Bob Noyce on this. I told him once that I read a survey or an article that said that half of Silicon Valley companies go out of business. And Bob Noyce, if you don't know who he was, he founded Fairchild. Well, he invented the integrated circuit. He founded Fairchild and he founded Intel. He said, maybe not enough fail. He says, when you fail, it means you're trying new things. So when you're starting up like that, you've got to do some experimentation. Try some things different. Try introducing yourself to other groups. Go, join. There's all sorts of organizations around. And I can tell you what one of the things that I did, I never joined a marketing or a PR association at all. I joined all industry associations. I didn't want contacts with people I was competing with. I wanted contacts with the people I was marketing to. And so, so when you went to the National Computer Conference, or I went to the international conferences in Europe, I paid my own tickets because I was bumping elbows with the people who needed your services and, or you thought needed their services, and you got to know people. You don't get to know that when you join associations that are, people that you live next door to. So I think it's very complex. It's a hard way to sell. It's a hard way but if you have something that you think is viable, don't give up. Keep trying and keep experimenting.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in right now, and Anu would like to actually interject at this point in time with some questions and comments that she has. So, Professor Basu.
Thank you, David. I was just actually building on Jared's question, the first question that he asks, and that's about customer. Basically, he's asking about customer development. So, before building an MVP, do you have any tips on how to reach potential customers to ask them whether they actually have a problem or not? Would it be through sort of Facebook groups or interest groups, or, particularly in today's world where you can't, post-COVID world, when you can't still go out and maybe meet customers? Do you have any suggestions on how to reach potential customers to, speak to them?
Yeah, I think we're caught in sort of a whirlwind of today's business because everybody, we got the complexity of so many different people online and so many different people, hawking their products and services online, that it becomes sort of there's a noise level is very, very high. When that happened, when it actually started, I reverted to more personal kinds of contacts, friends of friends. Of course, in that era, there weren't a lot of people around, but I came up with things like, well, I actually have it. I would prepare my own data. I don't know if anybody can see that, but this is a chart that I started creating, I don't know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And you can't see it, but what it is it's the, I would take the Mercury News annual report on the top 150 companies, and I would download that data, and then I would sort it by companies and by size, and I would list the top companies over 5 billion. And then everybody has to find it interesting as it went on. In 2000, there were 11 companies over 5 billion. In 2017, there were, there were 23. And last year there were 26. So, you know, it's been going like this when people think Silicon Valley was dying, but people started using this chart. I invited, I mean, you got to come up with different kinds of ways of doing this, but I would then create a book of charts of trade charts, international commerce charts. I would get them from government and other places, and I'd create a book. And every month I'd have that book Xeroxed and sent out to 100 executives. You know, on free, just from my own, you know, we were in the knowledge business, and journalists liked sitting in New York. There was no journalist on the West Coast in high tech in the 60s or the 70s. And so I started inviting the publisher and the head of editorial departments and their staffs to come out to the West Coast, and I'd put on a dinner, and then I would invite roughly between 50 and 100 presidents and CEOs from Silicon Valley companies to come to dinner with them. And you know, and I would get a fair amount there. I mean, we'd fill the restaurant. And there was two rules. One is that you can ask a question of either way, any question you want. But number two, nothing can be printed about it. And they became friends. I mean, Andy Grove told me that was one of the best advice he got. He ended up on Time magazine cover because he built a relationship with the editor of Time magazine. And he every time he went to New York, he would sit down with them. So, you know, these kinds of things take time, and they take sort of innovation and new ideas. And you've got to provide ways to educate the marketplace about who you are and what you do and what your product is. One other thing, and that is that Intel, most people don't even recognize this. Intel ran more courses on how to apply a microprocessor when the first processors came out than courses that were taught at De Anza on anything. And they had everybody in the company were giving courses around the country on how to apply it. So they turned themselves into an educational institution to develop that product, because it required a whole different way of thinking when the microprocessor. You didn't go out and select a bunch of components and put them together on a board anymore. That was a process that was done in the 50s and 60s. You now started programming the content of your devices. And that changed the history of the world, quite frankly, and how everything was designed, and how now why you can have all these gadgets that are portable and programmable. All of that changed everything because, quite frankly, the early companies were educators as much as technologists. So, you know, I can't tell you how to think. I can't tell you how to innovate. That's something that you have to work at yourself.
Very good. Thank you. Let me direct a question towards Andy here. We have somebody who's looking more from an international perspective, and she says, I was wondering, what are the issues that you find when you are working with international companies? How did you prepare to work with different companies? Andy? Looks like there's something wrong with your mic. No. Well, while they're fixing that,
You want me to answer?
yeah, why don't you go ahead, Regis?
I started building alliances, first off, with companies around the world, certainly through my clients. But I had alliances with a company in Australia. I had alliances with companies in Japan. I had alliances with companies in France. We eventually set up offices in 5 or 6 foreign countries. Not big offices, but enough offices to have contacts. You also have to travel to them and then go visit people and do exactly what you do in the United States. Most people speak English, or they speak it fairly well. But for Apple, I went to, I can remember going to Germany, and I gave seminars in Germany for Apple. I gave seminars in Japan for many of the high-tech companies here in Silicon Valley and on their products. So, you know, you again start spreading yourself and creating local contacts through alliances, and then you start traveling there. You have to bring your knowledge with you, and start doing some innovation in the brain power, and they appreciate that. They appreciate that. One of the international clients that I had in 1970s was the Irish Development Authority. Ireland was a third world country. It had dirt roads, it had no telecommunication systems, lousy ports, and they joined the common market and got some infusion of cash. They hired my company, largely me, to help them set up. I introduced them to Intel, Apple. I introduced them to Amdahl. I introduced them to a number of companies, and we set up a strategy for inviting them to Ireland and giving them tours of some of the assembly plants that were there for like pharmaceuticals, which were clean rooms. And then their engineering schools, which were exporting engineering students, started creating lists of people who specialized in either semiconductors or computers or software or whatever. And that became distributed. And but Ireland today is sort of a high-tech wonder of Europe. And their economy is booming. Now that Brexit has been, it was put into place, all of the big companies are putting offices in Ireland because they get tax-free shipments from Ireland to Europe. So you now do your manufacturing in Ireland, and not in Northern Ireland, which is part of Great Britain.
Thank you for that. And Andy, if your audio is back, why don't you pick up on that, and we'll follow up with the same question as far as how are things different internationally dealing with customers as opposed to domestically in your experience?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Woohoo! Thank you. Thank you, Regis, for answering that. That's great. Just to address the international issue, I think there has to be a pretty deep understanding of the different cultural issues in every country that you go to do business in. And you can't expect that their cultural values will be the same as our cultural values. So I've always found that in working with other countries, whether it's a client or whether it's my own office, you really have to embrace and understand the cultural situation that they have there. And that goes for selling your products too. Selling products in other countries is slightly different than it is. Everyone is not America. We all often like to assume that everyone is like American, and we in California like to assume everybody's just like California. But really, the world is filled with many different cultures, and understanding those is really critical to making a sale, whether it's my sale or whether it's a client's sale. So.
Let me give you an example of that, Andy. I mean, that Andy would appreciate, and it has to do with Apple. Apple management was putting together Apple Europe when the, I don't know if it was when the Macintosh or the Apple II came out, to set up sort of a bus tour across Germany to let executives come in, and they had the bus filled with, refitted with computers and chairs so they could sit down and type and practice and do things. And they were going to spend, I think it was something in the neighborhood of 50 million or more to do that. And I was asked to go to Europe and check it out, which I did. And I came back and I suggested they not do it. And the reason is, the executives in the early 80s and certainly in the 70s in Europe, and that's not just Germany, but that's all of Europe, they don't type. That's a job. Once they see a keyboard, that's a job for somebody that they hired to do that. And so, you know, it was this cultural difference that Andy was speaking about. You know, it would have been a waste of money because none of the executives would have stood there and looked at it. even some of the executives here in the United States were that bad. There was a guy who was the president of he came out with a phone. It was the first actually digital telephone, telephone. And he was bragging about it. And I went in, they were a client. I went into his office and he said, "Here's our video phone. Look at that. It's really great. It's sitting on my desk." And I said, "Oh, how does it work?" And he went over and he called his secretary and asked her to come in and do a demo. So,
That's great.
these are just little things, but they're important.
They are. They are, and they're different everywhere. So you got to be super sensitive.
So, there's another question on the changes in Silicon Valley over the decades. What changes have you seen in Silicon Valley over the decades and since you've been here, and how have you adapted to those changes?
Well, I'll do a quick answer. My tenure is less than Regis's, but it has been a few decades, and it's like adapt or die, right? And I think technology is constantly and forever changing the world, and being on top of it is kind of an important thing in the business that I'm in, and I just try to hang around people who are developing it. But so much has changed. I actually want to write an essay, and Regis will so appreciate this. Regis, remember when all the industry gatherings were at Ricky's Hyatt, which was this rickety old hotel in Palo Alto, and that's where kind of the industry gathered, and the industry was quite small at the time, and that's where important introductions and launches and meetings would happen. And then fast forward, through the .com thing that Regis talked about before, and on beyond that, we became an industry that went from what I call Ricky's Hyatt to the Rosewood Hotel, which is this big, fancy, expensive resort up on the top of Sand Hill Road. And it's when money entered the equation in a very large way, right? It became a magnet for money, and it attracted all kinds of things, right? When you have a lot of money, it attracts a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of nefarious creatures that end up roaming around your halls, and it changed, I think, the Valley forever. When we used to be this little group of nerds getting together trying to change the world, to becoming, how do we make the next $1 billion? And frankly, that it kind of saddens me that that's the case. But I have to say that innovation is innovation, and it will always be with us. And innovation in and of itself is a really inspiring thing. So I'm sad to see those old days kind of gone, but I'm also inspired by what people are doing with artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics and, space technology and all these things. They ultimately, I think, do make the world a better place, but people can use them to a negative effect, and that's just it's the nature of it. Technology in and of itself is not negative, but it's a tool that people can use one way or the other. So.
Yeah,
Regis.
I agree with all that. I of course, I started here in 1963, so it's been a lot of years, and I think I've gone through all the phases that Silicon Valley has gone through. In fact, I do have a pyramid chart of all the phases that technology has gone through. But I think that there is a pyramid that is still there, that sort of begins in chip design and works its way up through, the software and networks and communications and AI and so forth. And it just keeps expanding in sort of a, sort of a North Star way. But, the types of people within the industry have changed. I mean, I think one of the things that disturbs me most is sort of using Silicon Valley as a collective noun. If they're writing something negative about Facebook, they say Silicon Valley. They don't say Facebook, they'll say Silicon Valley companies. And, there's maybe 3 bad apples and there's hundreds and hundreds of other companies out there that are, very good technology and innovating tremendously well and doing innovations every single day that are not recognized. And I think that they're sort of overlooked because the noise gets the attention. And I think that's one of the things that has bothered me the most is seeing that happen. Facebook is not Silicon Valley. It's far from it. They aren't even a Silicon Valley company. They weren't financed the way companies in Silicon Valley were. Neither was Theranos, by the way. It was not financed the way Silicon Valley companies were. And quite frankly, the companies that looked at Theranos originally did exactly what they did. They went out and hired experts to look at it. And that's what any decent venture capital company would do, is they'd hire an expert to evaluate what is going on within that company. And quite a few were fed back. There's nothing there. And so, when you stay within sort of the old culture, I think there's a certain shell of protection that still kind of can help you, because it deals with being real. It deals with being, honest and forthright. And to me, quite frankly, that does come down to marketing, because marketing itself is built on trust. And I think, I gave up Facebook 3 years ago, haven't missed it, and don't intend to ever go back. And everybody I talk to, I convinced to give it up to. And now it's a small drop in a big bucket, but quite frankly, I don't trust them. And so I think that's the sort of fundamental basis of how you build relationships and you build companies.
All right. I have one more question, and I think I'll direct it to Andy first and then Regis. So in your lifetime experience, sometimes we learn the most from our worst experiences. In thinking about the worst startup client you ever worked for, what is one good lesson you learned from them or the experience? And let's go with Andy first.
I have to give you a story that involves Regis, and it was when I was working. So when Steve Jobs got fired from Apple, he ended up starting a company called Next, and he couldn't work with Regis because Regis was still representing Apple. So Steve called me, and I ended up getting the opportunity to help him with launch that company. And over the course of a few months, he decided, after about 5 or 6 months of working with me, that he wanted to fire me. So he fires me in a ceremonious way in his office with his chief financial officer, who was a woman and a friend of mine, sitting there next to him. And he said it was just because the quality of my work wasn't any good, and he wouldn't explain why or how. And of course, I was devastated. He owed me about $35,000 at the time, and I was quite devastated. And I went home, and the first person I called was Regis. Regis, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I called you and I said, what do I do? Steve fired me, and he owes me $35,000, and I don't have that kind of money to make payroll. What should I do? And you said something very smart to me. You said, well, in order to deal with Steve, you have to have something over him. And I said, I don't have anything over Steve Jobs. And he said, yes, you do. You have your relationships. Remember that word when it has to do with Regis. You have your relationships with the business press. And I immediately knew what he was talking about. And so I went back to the phone, and I called up my friend, the chief financial officer. I said, can you please get me another meeting with Steve so I can talk to him about this money that he owes me? And she said, yes, I'll do it the best I can. She was able to get me a meeting. I went into the meeting again with him and her sitting at the table. And I said, Steve, you owe me $35,000. I really would like to get paid. I need to make payroll. And he said, I told you I'm not paying you. I didn't like your work. And then I simply said to him this, following Regis's advice. I said, Steve, currently I get about 35 or 40 phone calls a week from business press reporters who ask me what kind of a guy you are to work with, and I currently tell them very nice things. And he immediately stood up, and he went to the back room and pulled out his checkbook and came back to the table and wrote me a check for $35,000 and rehired me. So my lesson is, A, listen to Regis. B, speak truth to power.
And Regis, what about you? What was the most powerful thing you've learned from a mistake?
Well, God, you make so many of them, it's hard to pick one. It sort of brings to mind, I don't know if you ever listened to Prairie Home Companion when it was on radio on Saturday and Sunday mornings, but it was sort of a new entertainment program but they always had these characters, and they had two cowboys named Rusty and Dusty, and they always would go out and they're out in the range, but it happened to be cowboys that were in a modern era. And Rusty came in, he wanted to go into a bar after they're coming off the trail. And Dusty said, "Now that looks like a pretty seedy bar. I think you're going to get some bad experiences in there." And Rusty said, "You know, the greatest lessons in life that I learned came from bad experiences." So, I just take a sort of a hint from Intel, which was they had a lot of failures in products, but they never gave up. They kept pushing the edges of the technology to get to the next one. And I think that, I've resigned a lot of clients because I just didn't want to work with them. And one of the clients was Bill Gates. I sat down and resigned him because he was no fun to work with. And he was envious of Steve. And that wasn't, and he thought everything was, everything we did was for Steve or for Intel. And so, I didn't need that in my life. So I basically decided not to do business with them. And, I think making good choices in your life, even though they seem very difficult, often turn out to be, good lessons. And I wouldn't regret any client that I resigned, quite frankly.
Okay, thank you. In the last minute here, I'm gonna turn it over back to Professor Basu to ask the last question and make any final announcements. And Professor Basu.
Thank you, David. Sadly, we've run out of time, but one last question, if you can just in a minute, it's from the audience as well. And that is, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self, to your younger self, to the budding entrepreneurs and marketers in the audience? Andy, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say just be fearless. There's nothing to be afraid of. And trying things, this is a wonderful place on the planet to try things and fail and get the opportunity to try again. That's what Regis was just talking about. And making mistakes is a good thing as long as you keep going, right? If you let any of these mistakes keep you from progressing or going forward, it's a real shame. And this is a place where mistakes are not only tolerated, but in many cases celebrated. And so you need to make mistakes in order to move forward. And the other thing I'll say is that there's another half to that. Making mistakes isn't enough. If you make a mistake, you have to own up to it. You have to own up to it and you have to fix it, right? Whether you fix it by saying, "Oh my gosh, I'll start over again, I'll try again," or if you fix it by, if you've hurt someone's feelings or whatever it is you do, if you make a mistake, you have to own up to that mistake. That's the second half of this mistake-making culture we have here. But that is what makes innovation. Innovation doesn't happen without mistakes.
Thank you. Regis,
Well,
your 20-year self.
Yeah, it would be my 20-year-old great-grandson. The world is getting more complex. Complexity is becoming one of the most significant issues in the world, both business and technology and in social interactions and social relations, government relations. Everything is just becoming more and more complex. There is more diversity, but with more diversity comes more conflict. I just read a paper last week that I was given many years ago by a professor out of CMU that he had written when he was in college in 1970 that said that the rise of all these new technologies is going to create more conflict, not less. And if you read the paper, you're convinced on that. So I think that we're sort of entering this age where information is going to be doubling at an incredible rate. There is more information generated in the last 2 weeks than was generated in the last, since man started recording history. since man started recording history. So that's all the museums of the world, if you will. And then I look at Buckminster Fuller's knowledge doubling curve. You know, in 1900, knowledge doubled every century. In 2000, it doubled every 2 to 3 years. In 2000, it doubled every 12 hours. And today they're talking about every 2 hours. The total knowledge in the world in terms of total amount of it is doubling every few hours. And that means that you have to make yourself more knowledgeable of more diversity in your knowledge base. So, you know, I read everything I can. I keep up. I keep in contacts with all the technologies I can. I still sit on quite a few boards, and I read sociology, psychology. I don't read any marketing books. I don't. It's just I don't want to be biased. But you know, I read economics. I read history. And things of that nature, and you keep up with what's going on in our current world, because that's the world you're going to live in. That's the world you have to respond to. That's the world you have to communicate inside or outside, whether you're inside a company, outside of it. And so the more you can equip yourself with knowledge about what's this sort of interaction that's going on in this complex world, I think the more valuable you're going to be in terms of the job that you hold or the position that you hold. And then the second thing I would say is always work up in an organization. You know, what you find out when you start out in business is that you can't solve the problems as a marketing person or as a PR person or as whatever it is. Those are not normally the problems that can be solved. You solve them by getting management to change a lot of ways, change their thinking. So if there are major issues in a corporation, you have to get that knowledge, you know, sort of permeating throughout the organization. That's where, when Andy was talking about, you know, the culture of a startup, it becomes so vitally important to have that from the beginning, because they've got to get, you know, used to it and not be jealous about what they know and don't know. And people do become jealous within organizations about hoarding their own information and what they know or don't know, or who they know or don't know. And so you have to be more generous in terms of your own expression, and then people will be more generous in return with yours. So Silicon Valley is a great learning pot. We're churning all the time. There's always something new. It's a great experience to just get yourself involved in it and learn how to respond to it.
Well, thank you very much. We're a few minutes over time here, so we should probably close off. I want to thank Regis for kind of taking a step out of retirement here to meet with us tonight. And Andy, it's always wonderful to have you. As you've joined in our talks so many times. So appreciate you joining out tonight. Professor Bonsu has also posted the links to the Ideas Club and to the Zen Starter program, which is open right now. So I want to make note of that for all of you. And Professor Bonsu, is there any last comments you want to make to our guests?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Regis. Thank you so much, Andy. Wonderful to see you both. Thank you so much for joining and speaking with us. Fascinating talk. And for everyone else who's here, attendees, we have a couple more sessions coming up this semester. So please go to the SVC website and check out. We may have one next week and then in December. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good
Thanks,
luck.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.